question that pops up all the time in my trainings and my workshops is what postures or what actions do I no longer teach, do I no longer practice? Now, I want to preface this by saying I don't think any posture is inherently bad or wrong. It's just I look at it from a risk to reward standpoint. If I think something is worth the risks, the reward is great enough, we do it, or I do it. If I don't, I don't, okay? So the 5 things that I no longer teach or very, very rarely teach are, number 1, full splits, okay? Full splits for me are not something I teach. Why? Because how do most people practice full splits? They come into full splits or they work towards full splits by laying in full splits, okay? So when you come into full splits, when you think about it, where is the load of the body? When you come forward with one of your legs, okay? Let's get this guy's leg fixed. Let's go forward with this leg. And this guy's been doing too many splits that his hip fell off, right? I'm just kidding. But anyways, so you're here. Your legs are straight. One leg is going forward, one leg is going back. Where's all the force happening? It's going straight down, right into the hip joints, okay? So if we're just laying in these postures, we're coming into these deep postures where we're not having any muscular engagement, all of the force of your body is jamming into the joints. That, to me, is not worth the risk, okay? So do I want longer hamstrings? Absolutely I do. Do I want to have more flexible hip flexors? Absolutely I do. You know what I do? I just do them in other postures. So I have the flexibility in my hamstrings, in my hip flexors to do splits. I choose not to do it. Why? Because I know if I call out splits in my classes, what are most people going to do? They're going to come into and they're just going to lay into this pose here. Now, if you're somebody who really wants to work into splits, what would I recommend? Right foot is pulling backwards, left foot is pulling forward. I have a lot of action going through the body. I'm not trying to just hang out in splits. I'm trying to pull myself in the splits. I'm trying to build strength and length. Because if there's strength in this posture, then the load comes down and then gets spread out through the legs using the muscles. If there's no muscle engagement, right down here. So splits are a no-go. Why? Because I know people. People don't want to work in splits. Why? Because it's hard. So I don't teach it. I don't practice it. What do I do if I want to get my hamstrings? There are 1,000 postures to work into the hamstrings in yoga. If I want to get into hip flexors, there are 1,000 poses that get into the hip flexors. I just choose not to go to the full extreme and say, hey everybody, now let's turn it on, because nobody's going to, okay? So full splits are a no-go for me because I don't want to put the load here. I would rather train the hamstrings, train the hip flexors in different positions. Number 2, Shirshasana, traditional headstand, or really tripod headstand as well. I do not teach those. Why? Okay, when you look at this, notice the difference in the size of these bones here. This is the head, by the way. Head sits right here. Notice the size of your cervical spine, the bones, versus the size of the bones down here in your lumbar spine. What does that tell us? That tells us that this is meant to handle load. This is meant to move. This is not meant to have all your body weight on it. This is meant to handle the load, right? To take on the weight. So, number 1, when we look at it from an anatomical position, not meant to hold the weight, meant to hold the weight, okay? That's first and foremost. Number 2, why do people not handstand or forearm balance? Why do they not attempt a handstand or forearm balance as a teacher when you call it out in class? They're scared. They're scared they're gonna fall. They're scared they're gonna get hurt. They're scared they may hurt somebody else. But that same person, when you call out headstand, does not kick up or does not have that fear and starts to kick up in the headstand. Why? Because the fear factor is not there in headstand. So more like people who don't have the proper setup to do headstand, attempt headstand. Now, if you have the proper setup and you're actually in your shoulders more than your neck, right? Really not in your head at all. Basically, you can lift your head off the floor. If you're in all that, headstand's fine, but most people aren't ready for that. So when you say headstand in class, if I have a room full of 30 people, I can't run back into the corner and make sure that Steve is going to not kick up and is going to have the proper setup. Or that Susie over here is not going to rush herself to somewhere she's not. Because why? Because it's fun to get upside down. People love it. And the fear factor isn't there. So if somebody is like, Tate, I really, really want to learn how to headstand, I will say, okay, great. First, we need to learn how to forearm balance and we need to handstand before we ever put pressure on here. Why? Not meant to handle the load, meant to handle the load. Needs a proper setup that most people don't have or have the knowledge for or the patience for because they just want to get upside down. So the risk of injuring something up here, which I have heard, seen learned about the risk of injury up here in a headstand, not worth the reward of getting upside down. If you want to work on getting upside down, forearm balance, handstand, while much more difficult to actually achieve any sort of balance in, much safer, much better, much stronger of a posture. Number 3, I no longer teach traditional pigeon, traditional half pigeon. Take back. I teach it only if I'm teaching king pigeon, the back bend, and we are actually trying to create lift off the floor rather than folding into the floor. The reason for it is most modern bodies have really weak glutes and really weak outer hips, which means what? The piriformis, especially in a yoga practice, which connects sacrum to femur, okay, is overtaxed, overloaded, overworked, overstretched. And then we come into pigeon and we crank on that thing even further, okay? So I don't like to teach it because most people don't have the strength in the hip and in the glute to actually be able to do this posture where there's a real good benefit for it. Also, the potential, or a lot of people in a modern body are actually starting to get knee pain in pigeon. Why? Because the femur and the tibia are on different levels, right? Your thigh bone and your shin bones are on different levels, different angles, which means that as I come into pigeon, if my hip can't handle the load, where's it gonna go? Down, and it's gonna force either to the inside or the outside of the knee, because it may also create a little bit different rotation of your shin bone versus your thigh bone. So I'm not gonna show it here because I have plenty of videos on it, but I practice the 90-90 version of pigeon. Why? Because it takes it off of the piriformis and it takes the pressure out of the knee and allows us to get a stretch into the outer hip, but also it allows us to create strength because it's a much more stable position to add a strength component to the stretch. So half pigeon, unless we are trying to lift up rather than fold down, is off the table in my teaching, in my practices, again, because the risk to reward. And also, honestly, I don't get anything out of it. My hips have never gotten really much out of pigeon, so there's a little bias there. Number 4, anything with a foot or a leg behind my head. Why do we need to be able to do that? Besides bedroom things, right? Okay, besides significant other things. Why would we need to be able to put my leg or my foot behind my head? There's no reason for it, okay? Because I can get all of the range of motion I need in my hips doing things that are safer. Because what most people do, when you say, let's try to come into these poses with the foot behind it, they're gonna take it and they're going to crank it. And then they may have a teacher stupidly trying to push them into it as well, trying to assist them further and potentially doing something to the hip, okay? So we don't need that range of motion, especially that range of motion to get the foot behind the head a lot of times comes with the lack of ability to strengthen in that end range. And when there's a lack of strength in an end range, it's not something that we can control, and a lot of times it leads to issues down the road, okay? So anything foot behind the head, out the window. Now, with all of these things, I have to say, I have taught them many, many, many times for many, many, many years. This has all just come with more knowledge of the body, more knowledge of what the body needs, and more knowledge of how to do things a little bit different. And then the last thing I don't practice anymore is full binds. I no longer will full bind with the hands grabbing each other. The reason for it is most people, when they come into these full binds, they have to torque the torso or the hips into a position that is not optimal to get the hands here. And they're no longer in what we're trying to do. Take side angle, for example, right? Side angle, I'm just gonna stay low with this knee down. Side angle is here, right? We're here, side angle.
This is side angle.
So then we take it with a half bind, side angle. But then when we say, grab the full bind, and people come into the full bind here, and then you say, okay, now rotate your torso to the left. I'm here. Most people are here. And what is this? This isn't side angle anymore, okay? This is some bind forward fold thing. So A lot of times we overcompensate somewhere else to get the hands together. Now, internal rotation that we get from the binds, so good for the shoulder. But the problem is when we grip those hands, when we grip the hands, it is just stretch. And with the shoulders, because there is less bone structure, we need to make sure that there is more strength and control and balance in the shoulder, not just flexibility. Because if it's just flexible, the more flexible something is without strength, the bigger chance for instability, okay? So we need to make sure that whenever we're stretching the shoulder, there's some strength in there, or when we create range of motion, we need to make sure that there is strength in there. And when the hands are together, the shoulders tend to shut off, and now we're just stretching. So binds are great for creating internal rotation, for creating flexibility in the shoulder. Not so good for strength in the stretch. So if you are looking to continue to bind, okay, what I would suggest you do is instead of gripping hands, press knuckles together. Because what happens is now the shoulder has to take you into position and then hold you here rather than, okay, now I can relax. I can relax in this depth here, okay? Now it's not gonna feel as good, not gonna feel as juicy, right? But we're here. Or if you do like to grip, think about trying to break the bind with the hands. Because as I pull the hands apart, what it does is it turns the shoulders on. So I'm trying to break the bind while holding the bind, okay? So here or here. Or you know what? Just work other positions of internal rotation like a sleeper stretch or a half bind, right? All of those things do really, really well. The other reason I don't teach binds a lot is because when you get into a really deep position and you have the hands clasped, what tends to happen is when you start to feel that, oh shit, I gotta get out of this pose, what happens is they tend to then go, and they fall out of it. Versus if my hands are here, I can just pull apart. Versus here, it's a more of an abrupt kind of jerk out of the pose. So for me, full binds, the benefit of a full bind I can achieve in other postures while creating way more strength in other sort of actions. And the full bind to me is just, it's something I don't teach and I don't practice because most of the time to get the full bind, people aren't in a position with the spine, with the torso, or the hips that we want them to be in. So those are my 5 things. Again, I have taught those things many, many times over the years. They're just things that I don't think that the reward is worth the risk. Now, you could come to me and say, the reward is worth the risk, and I would say, good, go for it. Go for those poses. But for me, those 5 things are off the table just because I don't see the reward worth it.